Jar. Hey, bear jaw. I fill that with marbles. Jar. These jars. Fire extinguisher jar. Jar. Big jar. Aquarium jar. How about piss? Look at them jars. Jar. This is a jar. Jar. 3 jars. Jars. Dye jar. These jars. This is a jar. This is a jar. There's a jar. Jars. This one's got feathers. Is this a jar? Little jars? It's not a jar. Better jar. Cups jars? I think I'm gonna stick some marbles in this puppy once I wash it out. Is this a jar? Peanut butter jar is a jar. Well, this one's glass too. Oh, I'm gonna use this jar. Tartar jar. Ooh, and there's tins. My God, there's even jars in the refrigerator. Jars. Wonderful jars. Jar of mayonnaise. Jars. This door's a jar. Jars. That's a jar. Is this a jar? Jar. This jar. Is this a jar? Here's a jar. Or many jars. This one's got checkers in it. Secret jar. Jars. Is this a jar? Jar. Eggs jars. Huh. Jar. These are jars. Jar. Vases, jars. Jar. This is a jar. Flower pots, jars. This is a jar. This is a jar. Jars.
Spray, is this a jar?
Found this dad on the sidewalk one day. He's in the jar. It's a jar. Jar. Where is hair in this jar? Good jar. Jar. Is this a jar? Found some jars. Is this a jar? Is this a jar? This a jar? Here's a jar. Guess is this a jar? Cookie jar. It's a jar. It's a jar. It's a jar. This is just a sick ass unicorn. Yeah, with that giant box of jars. Actually, I just need more jars. Guess is this a jar? Is this a jar? Am I in a jar?